Welcome, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another exciting edition of Solar Now and the Future with its economic impact. If you join us on a regular basis, the slogan for this show is there's power in numbers, then the Positive Change Purchasing Cooperative LLC captures that power for your financial benefit. The Positive Change Purchasing Cooperative LLC serves as an economic blueprint for renewable energy companies, both large and small, along with increasing market share for African and African American energy costs at our historically black colleges and universities to utilize black owned farmlands and HBCU campuses to develop capacity and initiatives for renewable energy projects to bring down the underemployment of young African and African American men and women locally, nationally, and throughout the diaspora. Also, to educate the African and African American community about the economic impacts of climate change and the need for environmental education through Black Talk radio programs such as Solar Now and the Future with its economic impact on Black America. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your host, Bethea. And you know, if you join us on a regular basis, the, the oh, the purchasing cooperative LLC. Today's date is September the 3rd, 2025, and we're all blessed just to be alive here in the North American climate where we, in fact, have been put in a very, very difficult situation. Ladies and gentlemen, just briefly, Marcus, I'm doing my podcast. What is it?
All right, Dad. I was just trying to. I see the trash people. I don't even know if they picking our trash up or not. I'm all the way down the street, so I can't tell if they. I was just trying to see, make sure they picked it up. That's it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, apologize. I had to take a call from my son. Ladies and gentlemen, you know if you join us on a regular basis, the slogan for this show is there. If there's power in numbers, then the Positive Change Purchasing Cooperative LLC captures that power for your financial benefit. The Positive Change Purchasing Cooperative serves as an economic blueprint for renewable energy companies, both large and small, along with increasing market share for African American and African renewable energy companies to address the high energy costs at our historically black colleges and universities, to utilize black owned farmlands and HBCU campuses to once again develop capacity and initiatives for renewable energy projects. Ladies and gentlemen, this show, we don't have a scheduled guest for the day, but I have a very, very interesting uh, some very, very, very interesting subject matter that we need to be having this discussion in the African American community about what's going on as it relates to litigation which has been filed surrounding as it relates to the going on of litigation that's being carried out in the federal courts here in our nation's capital. There's been little or no coverage about these entities. These are very, very important and landmark uh, cases as it relates to renewable energy and our African American community. As many of you know, I have been reporting on what's been going on in the space as it relates to how government, federal, state, and local policy impacts on the African American community as it relates to renewable energy and projects and our companies in that marketplace. Um, Also, you know that this show, if you go it on a regular basis, is being joined is brought to you every week by the National Association of Blacks in Solar, which I presently serve as chairman of the board of directors. I've served for the past 5 years as the president of the organization. We recently elected about a year ago a new president, Mr. Nathaniel Daly, young dynamic brother who will we are hoping that we will be able to get some strong leadership from his direction as we look at trying to pass the torch on to the next generation. Also, ladies and gentlemen, this show is brought to you every week by the Black Sports Legends Foundation, BSLF HBCU Solar Radio Talk Show Initiative, which we have sponsored this show since its inception. Ladies and gentlemen, as I've indicated, we don't have a scheduled guest today, but our lead-off subject matter, our topic of discussion today we will look at what is going on actually as it relates to several cases that are now pending in front of federal court here, as I've indicated, in Washington, D.C. Now, we don't have our system adjusted so that we're able to take our calls from the general public as we've done in the past. We've still been working on trying to get some of these issues um, really remedied, and at this till this point, we have not been successful in being able to get some clarity with the present platform that we're using for our podcast, Podbeam, on our introductory music and other things that we use to make this show more feel with giving us the time to take breaks to sort of switch gears. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, today's topics are lead off topic is as I, my me as your host, Ronald Bethea, as the host of Solar Now and the Future with its economic impact on Black America is what does these cases mean to the African American community? The leadoff case, judge dismisses EPA grant termination lawsuit. Now, this particular article was authored by Alex Gulen, and it was published on 8/29/2025. The second article that we're going to analyze is going to be also authored by the same gentleman, and it was authored on June 18th of 2025. Judge rules EPA determination of environmental justice grants unlawful. Now, let's look at the latest decision And let's go to, well, let's go at, we'll start with the earlier decision back in June. Back in June, there has been a plethora of issues surrounding, if any of you have been following me on this platform, of issues around the greenhouse gas initiative, which was a part of Executive Order 140996, which was the first executive order that President Biden signed the first day he came into office, which gave rise to invest in America agenda, which gave rise to the Justice 40 initiative. And in this particular executive order, it says that 40% of all investment from across the 6 federal agencies, 40% had to be targeted to low and moderate income communities. But this particular initiative, which a judge ruled back in June, according to the article which was published in Politico, went on to state the following. A federal judge on Tuesday ruled that EPA's determination of $600 million in environmental justice grants issued by the Biden administration for low income areas and communities of color was unlawful. The ruling over Thriving Communities Grant Program comes as EPA is separately appealing a ruling that it is its determination of $20 billion in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund grants also were unlawful. Congressional Republicans have proposed rescinding funding for both grant programs as part of their reconciliation bill. The Thriving Communities Grant Making Program was part of a $2.8 billion program of funding under the Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act for community groups to provide block grants to address pollution that take the disproportionate heavy toll of communities of color and low incomes in rural areas. So this is talking about the Mississippi's, Louisiana's, Cancer Alley, and those communities that are being disproportionately impacted by what we call Cancer Alley. We know is over 100 miles of petrochemical plants, and they're basically been built in African and low income white communities in Louisiana and Mississippi. Now, EPA's determination of the grants violates the Administrative Procedure Act. The judge ruled Adam Alberson of the U.S. District Court of the District of Maryland. EPA contends that it has the authority to thumb its nose at Congress and refuse to comply with its directive, which constitute a clear example of agencies acting in excess of statutory just jurisdiction authority or limitations or such statutory rights and thereby violating the APA right. Addison, which was a Biden appointee, rejected the argument of EPA made that it was a similar case that the grant termination was effectively a contract dispute that must be heard by a special court, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Instead, he ruled that EPA determination of grants because of the administration opposes environmental justice efforts were unlawful precisely because Congress intended the agency to spend it on environmental justice activities. Congress expressly required EPA to use the appropriated funds for environmental justice programs. by terminating the plaintiff's grants on the basis of current EPA leadership no longer wants to support environmental justice program. EPA exceeds its authority under the Clean Air Act and therefore was in excess a statutory or limitations under the Administrative Procedures Act, Allison ruled. Now, this is a case that has already been ruled on, stating that EPA did not have the authority to cancel these grants. Ruth Ann Norton, CEO of the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, praised the ruling. What the EPA does next, we don't know, she said, but we're super happy for communities that are intended to receive these dollars to deal with many things around the environment, quality, and public health. GHHI has prepared to pass through funds to initially 117 projects across multiple states to address issues like lead contamination in West Virginia. Norton said, we hope the EPA doesn't, in fact, work against our own priorities in a way by wanting to undermine this. The other groups that bought suit similarly praised the ruling in a statement. Minneapolis Foundation's president and CEO R.T. Rybank called it a win for local communities, while Philanthropy Northwest's CEO Jill Nashi said communities must impact most impacted by environmental harm deserve access to resources committed to them by federal law. Now, this gets real touchy because what has happened, ladies and gentlemen, I was able to speak with a young lady with who is the communications director. Her name is Stephanie Ebbs. And we're going to look at what has taken place since June. As I indicated, this was a June 18th article in Politico. And on the last week, and this is how the politics gets played here in Washington, D.C. In the last week of August, Friday, the last day of the working day of the month, a judge, which was appointed by the Bush administration, judge dismisses EPA grant termination lawsuit. The same author, Alex Gilligan, 8/29/2025. It was also published in Politico. Has ruled for the first time that EPA has the power to rescind grant awarded by the Biden administration. A federal judge ruled on Friday and tossed out the lawsuit brought by 24 nonprofit organizations. Now, the case in point is this particular lawsuit impacting the greenhouse gas initiative. Let me give you a little history. The greenhouse gas initiative had $27 billion originally for CDFIs, community development corporations, or lending institutions to serve as pass-throughs for nonprofit organizations and companies, and Inside of that, there was $20 billion. That particular funding was placed with signed contracts with the government and nonprofit organizations in the coffers of Citibank outside of the physical bank parameters of EPA. There was another $7 billion known as the Solar for All initiative, which started here in Washington, D.C. in 2011 by a dear friend of mine, Mr. Ted Trabue, who was formerly the director for the DC Sustainable Utility Organization. And it was started by him, Mr. Mark Davis of WDC Solar, which is one of the founding members of the National Association of Blacks in Solar, and an NFL Hall of Famer who played for the Burgundy and Gold here in Washington, D.C., who was working with a construction company that was doing training in renewable energy sector area. Daryl Green, many of you know him, NFL Pro Hall of Famer. They started the Solar for All initiative here under the guidance of Tommy Wells, who has been on this platform. It's been a number of years, but Tommy has come on my show several times talking about the Solar for All initiative and how it needed to be expanded nationally. Yours truly, I've done a number of public testimonies in front of the DC Public City Council and Public Service Commission around this issue of funding the Solar for All program and why the Biden and Harris administration needed to take up this pilot program and it goes nationally. Well, this program was picked up by the Biden and Harris administration, and $7 billion was put in this pilot that was started here in Washington, D.C. That is the history of the Solar for All program, how it originated here in Washington, D.C. Now, what has taken place since then is that a judge has ruled after the Department of Energy and EPA awarded to 60 grantees nationwide $7 billion for renewable energy projects. On yesterday, I had the privilege of speaking with Mrs. Pamela Powers. She's with the Maryland Clean Energy Center here in the state of Maryland, and they serve as the green bank for the state of Maryland. They were originally supposed to be receiving $62 million for the Solar for All initiative. This is what is very, very disturbing about this, ladies and gentlemen, is when the Trump administration came into office back in January, it in fact put a 90-day freeze on all funding and all programs. Then the organizations that had been vetted, who had signed contracts, both nonprofit and private entities and state entities, public partnerships, these organizations signed these contractual agreements with our government to receive this funding, and they had to plan, execute how these programs were going to be initiated and all the states that were selected in all 50 states, how these programs were going to be selected. In the process, I put together a partial listing of African American owned organizations, led organizations. One of those organizations was based in Jackson, Mississippi, called Hope Credit Union, which was due to receive $62 million for the state of Mississippi and $94 million for the state of Arkansas. This funding and, and their rollout of their plan was after they had initiated, as well as the Maryland Clean Energy Center here in Washington, D.C., had initiated their timeline to get the contractors that were going to do the work for these programs. Let me give you an example. Based on the timeline for the Maryland Clean Energy Center here in the state of Maryland, as we looked at what was going on here on July 30th, 2025, the Solar for All program, the Maryland Clean Energy Center put out an email stating on July 30th, RQFQs for frequently asked questions. A pre-proposal conference was to be held on August the 12th. Deadline for recipients of the questions was supposed to be August 26, 2025. Proposals were due September the 9th. Tentative date for contract awards September the 30th, 2025. Now, it's very, very interesting to me, ladies and gentlemen, that the same thing played out in Mississippi and all across the country as organizations were somewhat hesitant after they knew that they were supposed to be receiving these funds because of the 90-day freeze. They were only allowed to draw down about 15% of the actual funds. And this 15% actually covered their costs to apply for these grants. This is the information I was able to get from Mrs. Powers through the Maryland Clean Energy Center here in Washington, D.C., in the state of Maryland. They're located in College Park, Maryland. I spoke with her on yesterday concerning their litigation because all of the litigation was not in one case. You had different entities that have brought lawsuits against EPA here in the state of Maryland. The Maryland Clean Energy Center referred their issue for litigation to the state's attorney's office, Anthony Brown. Now, whether that case has been filed or not, I cannot speak. Whether the suit has actually been filed or not, I cannot speak to that issue. What I can speak to is that this program was supposed to benefit 900,000 low and moderate income residents in the United States of America across these states where these 60 entities that had entered into contract and been vetted and signed agreements with the government. Now, let's sort of look into this article that was done on August the 29th, 2025. it's very, very interesting that Zealand waited until August, I think it was the 12th of August. No, it was the 15th of August to put out the final notice from EPA stating that they were going to cancel and terminate these grants and nobody would be receiving funding from the Solar for All $7 billion fund, which was still under EPA's authority and in their coffers. Now, the reason why I titled this article, What Does That Mean to Black America, is that we had less than there was over 13,000 solar and renewable energy companies doing business in the U.S. when President Biden came to office in 2020. We had less than 100 African American owned renewable energy firms in the renewable energy sector, period. As it relates to those installation and design firms, we had less than 35. As it relates to environmental engineering firms, I have been not able to identify more than 10. So when you talk about software development, tech companies, and other groups, advocacy groups, church groups that are in the area, when you combine all of them together, you got less than 100 companies, nonprofits, and entities that are African American led in the renewable sector. This was the first time that we would have been able to get a serious leg up, and the type of investment that was needed to grow these organizations and these companies. And that's been snatched away. That impacts our communities because individuals such as myself, who was trying to utilize the program, I no longer have that option. So I have to look at now whether I entered into a power purchase agreement. Also, we have to look at the fact that the 30% federal tax credit has been rescinded. It was due to sunset, I think, 2032 or 2030. Well, it's been moved back to December 31st, 2025. Let's look at this impact, ladies and gentlemen. The federal judge on Friday tossed out lawsuits brought by almost 24 nonprofit organizations. Now, I'm going to click on that blue link to see if it'll give me the name of those organizations. And it did not do that. So what we're going to do, we're going to go back and we're going to look at groups and localities whose environmental justice grants were terminated by EPA. That was a part of, I guess, their paywall. So, with that being said, the Supreme Court has made it clear that challenges to terminate grants must be heard by a special tribunal. The judge ruled it's the first time a court has ruled in EPA's favor regarding grant determinations. Now, we just had a ruling in June saying that what EPA was doing as relates to environmental justice grants was illegal. But we're talking about the same greenhouse gas initiative. The ruling marks a blow for hundreds of recipients of funding from EPA and other agencies who have been seeing huge swaths of grants canceled because the Trump administration disapproves of spending through, though they may be able to pursue damages in a different court. A little background, ladies and gentlemen. Democrats, the Inflation Reduction Act included $2.8 billion, a chunk of money for environmental and climate justice block grants. The money was to be used by community groups to address environmental issues in historically disadvantaged communities. Like many other parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, the grants were terminated en masse by the administrator Lee Zealand earlier this year. Now, this guy, Zealand, is a piece of work. But for the Democrats to have approved him for this position, I don't understand. He had to go through an approval process. And the question wasn't asked, or was it asked, if you are appointed to head the Environmental Protection Agency, will you in fact follow Congress's mandates? Congress approved this money to be spent. It's not EPA's authority. Congress is supposed to have the authority. That is what the other judge ruled. Congress has subsequently revoked unobligated funds under the RIA. Now, this is where the politics and the games get nasty, ladies and gentlemen. It's something called H.R. 1. I refer to it as the big brutal steal of a so-called bill, which does not just affect Medicaid, Medicare, and shut down rural hospitals, but it rescinded in executive orders, separate executive orders. I refer to this individual as COVID 45 plus 2 with 34 felony counts coming straight at you, who has rescinded all of the investment tax credits for manufacturing, for the electric vehicle industry. We are looking at a catastrophic situation where in Clean Energy 2.org, you can go and Google it, and it'll give you a breakdown of $133 billion of U.S. and foreign corporations that committed investment in 497 renewable energy projects across all 50 states in the U.S. And many of these projects was the largest investment that has ever come to these states. And the sad part about it is President Biden, using his strategy of trying to put the majority went into red congressional districts. $109 billion of this investment out of the 33 billion. Only about 20 point so billion went into blue congressional districts. The irony is none of the Republicans voted for the Inflation Reduction Act that created these opportunities. Margie Taylor Greene, in her district, there is a corporation called QCell. It is a South Korean billionaire who has invested $3.1 billion, and they have built the largest solar manufacturing facility in the North American hemisphere. It is in Margie Taylor Greene's district, it's which she is not deserving of. But she took credit. She didn't vote for it. The fact of the matter is, I've spoken to African Americans, family, as well as business associates and friends about Dalton, Georgia. And when you get a population breakdown, you find out that it is approximately almost 70 something percent folks don't look like me. And my cousin referred to them as RNs, short for rednecks. Now, I'm not making this up. He lives, my wife's sister, who lives outside of Atlanta. He's a retired engineer. My wife's sister is an attorney who's retired. So they live right outside of Atlanta in a black middle class. And they say, look, you you must, I ride, Orlando said, yeah, I ride through there. He said, you don't see as many Confederate flags anymore. You just see Trump flags. You don't see the X's no more. You just see the Trump flags. Now, I grew up in South Carolina, so ain't nobody got to tell me about it, so I understand. I'm from one of those small rural towns. We've referred to them as a two-shoe town. Nobody had shoes but the white man and the mule. So I understand exactly what's going on and the lack of opportunity for our young people who grow up in those towns who have to end up going to the military because there's no jobs, because the private sector had been moved out. Biden bought $12.1 billion to the state of South Carolina. There was a number of major projects coming into that has come to the state of South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina that has to be canceled. There is a corporation called Albemarle Corporation. They are based out of Australia. Their corporate headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina. They were due to build a lithium manufacturing facility in Chester County. You're talking to someone who's worked on a project for 5 years to build a solar power plant to power that manufacturing facility, which I don't think will come to fruition because of Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott and the crew. I have serious problems with that because they are talking about crime and issues. Poverty creates crime and creates these issues. If you don't give people opportunities to do to get a job that will pay a livable wage, that is what you're going to have. So The fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, this is not something that I take lightly. Let's continue to look at the impact of this decision. Now, Leon A. W. Bush appointed to the Supreme Court orders in other grant determination cases. A law called the Tucker Act requires contract disputes with federal governments to be heard by the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Leon said, agreeing with EPA's long-standing legal defense. Leon, a George W. Bush appointee, pointed to Supreme Court orders in other grant determination cases, one involving educational grants that was issued in April and another regarding the National Institute of Health grants issued last week. In both cases, the High Court indicated that the grant determinations must be heard by the Court of Federal Claims. Leon rejected the jolted environmental grant recipients' artful plead arguments that their circumstances are different than those of the Supreme Court cases. Put simply, I cannot order the government to reinstate contracts and pay money due to them, he wrote. The reaction to this: Ben Gillett, a senior attorney for the Southern ELC, reiterated in a statement, SELC, the Southern Educational Law Center, who have been the lead law group representing these nonprofits. EPA's determination of that the grants was unlawful. We are currently reviewing an opinion and preparing to advise our clients on other steps. EPA is not reviewing the decision. Now, in context, last week, NIH ruling from the Supreme Court was broadly seen as a doubling down on messaging to the lower courts. The grant determination lawsuits belong in the Court of Federal Claims. EPA could see additional court victories on this issue soon, including the high-profile determination of the $20 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. EPA's determinations were blocked by district court judges early this year, and the matter has been pending on appeal for months. Now, that case was also appeals court pauses injunction against EPA's termination of climate grants. Judge Tanya Chukin said the agency had no rational explanation for determining the grant is issuing her now temporary stay in the injunction. Now, injunction was placed back in the fourth month, January, February, March, April 17, 2025. And that's why I wanted to do this show today, ladies and gentlemen, to show you how much litigation and how many injunctions are going on. The organizations aren't talking about this. The grantees aren't talking about this. right now, if you call any of these organizations, they will tell you, well, we can't have someone on your show because we can't talk about it because it's in litigation. Well, the fact of the matter is, the people who are supposed to be benefiting because of the funds are the ones who elected these damn officials. They need to be getting the information out to the public so they can call their congressmen and senators and have should have had this information before they went out for August for the reception. So this would have been an issue that would have been discussed. Nobody's talking about these issues. These are issues, these are pocketbook issues. Let me make it plain. You have regulatory organizations who regulate the cost of energy, price of energy, and what kind of energy can be used in each marketplace. Here in the 13th state region, where in the mid-Atlantic where I reside in Maryland, is part of the PJM. And that's North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, and I've left a few states out. Well, in 2023, the annual wholesale auction cost for what they call a megawatt day was $34.17. In 2024, before Trump was elected, he was running for office. He called a meeting with the tech industry and the fossil fuel industry and said to them, y'all put up $1 billion, y'all do whatever the hell you want to do. Now, we know because of campaign finance laws, I don't care if it's PACs, individuals, one source can't give him that kind of money. But you know, they can find a way, follow the money. Now, Trump comes to office January 20th, first day in office. The first person he made sure was out of office was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Willie Phillips, who was the first African American tapped by the Biden administration to head the Federal Regulatory Commission here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Phillips happens to be someone I consider as a dear friend. Great guy. He, in fact, made sure before the July wholesale auctions of 2024 that a petition of the lawsuit, which was filed by the Joseph Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, who filed that lawsuit in December of 2023 to block an 800% rate hike for natural gas. The PJM has 65 million customers, and those costs are passed directly on to us as consumers, spread across those 13 states in the District of Columbia. That rate hike was blocked. It was going to cost us $21 billion, which we would have saw June 1 of 2025 this year on our utility bills. As soon as that happened, the utility companies came back and filed for a 680% rate hike, and it got passed for 2025 and for 2024 and 2025. It's the highest rate hike. It was a 686% rate hike. It went from $34.72 for a megawatt day to $269 for a megawatt day. times 65 million customers, we went from paying 2.2 billion in 23 to 14.7 billion. We saw that June 1 on our electricity bill. Now, the fossil fuel industry is getting paid because data centers are off the chain with the proliferation of them, and they're using gas turbine technology. So that means the price of natural gas just went up. And your water bill, because you got to use large amounts of water to cool off those mainframes for those computers. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is not something that's not coming to you. If you can read your utility bill, I guess we need to have a course in high school and junior high to teach our young people how to read a utility bill, because evidently the parents can't. This is some serious stuff we're dealing with, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the Court of Appeals, this stay that was issued was Tanya Chuckin, U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia, exonerated EPA for what she called a thinly veiled attempt to dismantle the entirely of the congressional created programs. She's talking about Congress had the authority. EPA don't have it. Zealand don't have the authority. Trump don't have the authority. But this was payback for the fossil fuel industry. We are going to wreck the wind and solar industry. If you go to my website at positivechangepc.com, ladies and gentlemen, you can click on our news and events tab. You will be able to find, if you just go back to the last 4 months, a litany of articles backing up with data, backing up everything I'm saying today on this podcast, on my YouTube channel. And we're also on Podbean. This should be heard also as we're doing our show. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I've come to the end of another exciting edition of Solar Now and the Future with this economic impact that we brought you news that you can definitely use with this program. So with that being said, this show is brought to you every week, ladies and gentlemen, by the Positive Change Purchasing Cooperative, LLC, which serves as an economic blueprint for renewable energy companies, both large and small, along with increasing market share for African and African American owned renewable energy companies to address the high energy costs at our historically Black colleges and universities, to utilize Black owned farmlands and HBCU campuses, to develop capacity and initiatives for renewable energy projects to bring down the underemployment of young African American men and women locally, nationally, and throughout the diaspora. And let me sort of share with this because I got a few more minutes. Early this morning, I couldn't, sleep last night. So I sort of turned on channel 32, Howard Howard University's TV channel. And they were showing a documentary on the Republica RNC of Congo and the conditions because of the lack of electricity and the need for us to get our people concerned around the learning renewable energy, getting into this field and learning the technical as well as intricate piece areas such as becoming electricians for EV wiring for charging infrastructure, domestic as well as for construction. Also, to get into how to assemble, do the framing for PV panels for rooftops. People have to be trained for these areas, ladies and gentlemen. Yours truly, we went after a $19 million grant several years back. We were unsuccessful. But these are things that we need to have constant discussions. This program needs to be lifted up. I need your support to lift this program up. If you will go to our news and to our website at positivechangepc.com, you can click on the donate button and it'll take you right to a donation opportunity to support me and what I'm doing here on this platform. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the close of another exciting edition of Solar Now and the Future. And please remember that this show was brought to you by the National Association of Blacks in Solar and the Black Sports Legends Foundation, BSLF, HBCU Radio Talk Show Initiative, and the Positive Change Purchasing Cooperative, LLC, which I serve as the founder and CEO. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we don't want you to meet us back here. We want you to beat us back here as we close another exciting edition of Solar Now and the Future with its economic impact on Black America. Until next week, we say go in peace.